Let's talk about the end of the world. Hello again. As a natural pessimist, I am a fan of apocalyptic and dystopian fiction and have been for almost as long as I could read. And what I have here is a selection, not in the least bit comprehensive or representative of all the various permutations of apocalyptic or dystopian future fiction. These are some of my favorites that I've read over and over again. Each of these I've read multiple times over the years. Some come from pretty far back in my past in terms of when I first remember reading them, some a little bit earlier, and then some very recent. That's a new favorite of mine. Canticle for Liebowitz is probably in my top 5 desert island books. But what we're going to do today is run down briefly. We're going to do a choose your own apocalypse here. And I'm going to be choosing not the dystopian future that I prefer, but the dystopian future that is most likely to occur based on the current state of the world. So cover in a sentence or two the plot and general setting for each of these, and then we'll decide, well, I'll decide because it's kind of an autocracy here, I'll decide which one I think is most likely to come about. So the first one here on the list, I would have said for most of my life, and I first came across this in college. It was required reading for, actually, no. The book that was required reading was Neil Postman's great book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, but he references throughout the book Brave New World, and I had not to that point read this book, so in college I read it for the first time, and I've read it many times since, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. It's a dystopia in which the entire world is, well, the vast majority of the civilized world is entirely taken up with hedonistic, the seeking of pleasure and the numbing of the mind with various substances, various promiscuous sexual practices, with something akin to virtual reality, the feelies. And it amazed me how closely his description of the future world looked like the world in which I inhabited, or increasingly so, I guess. And so for most of my adult life, I would have guessed, yeah, our future is probably going to look quite a bit like Brave New World. In Neil Postman's book, he compares the future of Brave New World with the future as seen in 1984, which is probably even more familiar to you all. And for the record, Mr. Postman's assessment was the future in Brave New World is way more likely than the sort of overbearing, tyrant, all-controlling state as represented in 1984, primarily because people are very easily controlled when they are entertained, and people seek entertainment and will do anything to obtain entertainment. And when they're entertained, when people are entertained, they're not doing other obnoxious things to annoy their rulers. But so anyway, 1984, obviously a all-seeing, all-knowing government, controlling everyday actions, controlling the thoughts and the speech of everyday citizens. Likely, possibly, but we don't have to have Big Brother now forcing his way into our living spaces and monitoring us against our will every moment of every day. We carry our telescreens now in our pockets, and Big Brother can just subscribe to our feed if he wants to know what it is we're doing, because we'll tell him everywhere we go and everything we eat and every thought that we have. every moment of the day. So um, in a way, it's kind of Big Brother, but we willingly submit to Big Brother, I think would be more likely. Um, the third is actually the first of these apocalyptic books I read. And this I read in high school, Alas Babylon. This I went to high school in the 80s. So very much still a Cold War climate, approaching the fall of the Berlin Wall, but that was yet in the future. And this is a pretty straightforward book about the end of the world, the day after the bomb dropped. And it follows a group of everyday citizens in Florida who are surviving as best they can after a worldwide nuclear catastrophe and what that would look like. In the 80s, I guess I would have thought this was a more likely end to civilization, and I guess that remains to be seen. The next one is the third book in C.S. Lewis's space trilogy, that Hideous Strength, which when I got the space trilogy as a teenager, I loved the first book, loved the second book. This third book I did not immediately get, and had a hard time just slogging through it. But since then, I've returned to it many times, and it's my favorite of the series, and one of my favorite dystopian novels, really, out of them all. That Hideous Strength is a complicated book that is not easily reduced to a sentence or two, but what I mostly want to point out here is the way Lewis describes the kind of the ruling class, the inner circle of the inner circle, not just controlling the narrative, but actually shaping reality of what people experience by describing events in a way that they wish people to believe they happened. So if you read it in the paper, it must be true. I'm not gonna I'm not gonna say any more about that, but yeah, that seems feasible, let's say. Fantastic book, though, and it includes some kind of sci-fi, futuristic space things, along with demonology and the Arthurian legend weaved in a way that, yes, it's a head scratcher the first time you read through it, and just more magnificent the more times you read it. And the last one here, Canticle for Liebowitz, is a magnificent book, and I recommend it to anyone. And it takes place after a nuclear disaster, several hundred years after a nuclear disaster, and follows a location rather than a set of characters throughout. So there are 3 parts to the book, each taking place about 500 years apart, and pretty much all takes place around this abbey in the American Southwest somewhere. Geography and place names have changed a lot since the nuclear destruction, and the basic theme of the book, spoiler alert, I guess a little bit, is that humankind seems bent on its own self-destruction, and no matter how many restarts they're given, they will always tend to want to pervert the knowledge that they've regained in ways that are destructive, ultimately self-destructive. Definite recommend on that. Which of these dystopian futures do I foresee? Well, if you asked me maybe a few months ago, I probably would have stuck with something like Brave New World, because we as human beings, at least Western culture, are pretty easily swayed by that which is entertaining, and we never cease to find ways to entertain ourselves. But the events of the past several days make me think anything that destroys the world in a nuclear fireball is climbing the scales of probability even as we speak. So as of right now, and maybe I'll make a update on this depending on where we are on the nuclear destruction scale, but I'm going to say Last Babylon's starting to feel a lot like a blueprint for how I should plan my day. Um, so there we go. Some of my favorite apocalyptic fiction and my thoughts on where we're likely heading. Uh, if this is a genre of book that you enjoy, I'd like to get a recommendation from you of um, what you enjoy reading and furthermore, how you think the world will end. Some say in fire, some say in ice, etc., etc. So let me know. Comment. I always like to hear what you have to say. I appreciate you watching. Join me next time when I'll be doing Who Knows What. I appreciate you stopping by and hope to see you here again next time.